Ethan Carter was 12 years old the night his father packed a duffel bag by lamplight and left the house before sunrise. Two bad harvests and an early frost had put the family orchard so far behind on its banknote that Daniel Carter couldn't look his own neighbors in the eye anymore, and rather than watch the place get auctioned off in front of the whole county, he chose to disappear instead. He told Ethan almost nothing that last night. Just one sentence, said quietly over a compost pile behind the barn, the kind of thing a father says when he means something much bigger than the words themselves. Nothing in nature is ever really waste. Ethan didn't understand it then. He still didn't understand it 4 years later. On the afternoon, everything in this story actually begins. He was 16 now, and every day after school, he did the same strange thing. He drove his father's old pickup, the one Daniel had left behind, to the back lots of grocery stores, restaurant kitchens, and the county's lone juice bottling plant, and he filled the truck bed with orange peels. Hundreds of pounds of them over months. The county noticed. People filmed him on their phones without asking. The local paper ran a short, mocking item under the headline, "The Garbage Farmer," and nobody, at the school board meeting, objected when someone suggested, half joking, that the Carter boy had finally lost it. Then, on a Tuesday morning in early spring, two unmarked government trucks turned onto the gravel road that led to the old Carter orchard. Men in windbreakers, carrying soil probes and sample bags, walked the dead rows where nothing had been planted in years. A news helicopter passed low overhead twice before noon. The same neighbors who had laughed at Ethan the week before were suddenly standing at the fence line asking each other the same question. What did that boy find? To understand what happened in that orchard, you have to understand Ethan first, and Ethan was easy to misunderstand. He wasn't loud. He wasn't the kind of kid who explained himself when people stared. If a stranger asked what he was doing with a truck bed full of orange rinds, he'd just say "Compost Project" and let them walk away with whatever picture that word painted in their heads. Most people filled in the blank with something harmless and a little sad. A boy whose father had walked out on the family, building something in a shed because there wasn't much else in his life he could control. Some guessed he was feeding livestock, though the Carter place hadn't kept animals in years. Others assumed he was hoping to sell compost bags at the farmer's market for a few extra dollars, since money had been tight since Daniel left. One theory floating around the diner had him trying to qualify for some kind of recycling rebate that didn't actually exist in their state. Every guess missed by a mile, and Ethan never corrected a single one of them. The town found its own entertainment in it. Kids from his grade started leaving orange peels in his mailbox as a joke, and for a while it became a kind of running bit at the high school. One restaurant owner, handing over a garbage bag of rinds from the lunch rush, told him, not unkindly, "At least somebody appreciates our trash." Ethan just said thank you and loaded the bag into the truck. That politeness unsettled people more than anger would have. A boy who got mad when they laughed would have made sense. A boy who said thank you and kept coming back the next week, and the week after that, was harder to file away. His silence didn't read as weakness. It read as a kid who knew something the rest of them didn't, and that was the part nobody could quite let go of. His mother, Carol, who had raised him alone since Daniel left and now worked double shifts at the hospital to keep the house, worried more than most. She'd find him in the barn past midnight, sorting peels by moisture content in mason jars with masking tape labels, and she'd ask if he wanted to talk about his father instead of talking about oranges. He'd tell her he was fine, and mostly he was. He didn't have a plan he could explain to her, not one that would have made sense out loud. He just had a question that wouldn't leave him alone, and he'd rather chase it than talk about it. By the time the first hard frost came that fall, Ethan had close to 800 pounds of dried and processed citrus waste stored across 3 sheds behind the house, and not one person in town, including Carol, knew why. There was no hidden notebook behind any of this. No secret his father had left for him to find. Just one ordinary afternoon, a year before any of it started, that Ethan couldn't stop thinking about. He'd been helping a neighbor clear out an old compost heap behind the feed store, the kind that had been dumped on and forgotten for years, mostly kitchen scraps and yard waste gone black and crumbly at the bottom. Near one edge, buried under a season's worth of coffee grounds and grass clippings, was a pocket where someone had clearly dumped a bag of citrus peels the previous winter. The soil there looked different, darker, looser, and strangely, almost none of the weeds that had taken over the rest of the pile had managed to root in that one patch. Ethan mentioned it, offhand, to his agriculture teacher the next week, expecting maybe a sentence back. His teacher told him it was probably nothing, some quirk of drainage or sunlight, and moved on to the next topic without a second thought. Most 16-year-olds would have let it go right there. Ethan didn't. He couldn't have explained why if you'd asked him. It wasn't a hunch, exactly, and it definitely wasn't a plan. It was just a small, unfinished thing his brain refused to file away as nothing, the same way some people can't leave a loose thread alone once they've noticed it. He started reading whatever he could get his hands on. Old library books on composting, a stack of outdated agricultural bulletins the school let him take out of a storage closet nobody had opened in years. None of it answered his question directly. If anything, it just gave him more specific words for the thing he didn't understand yet, terms like soil biology and microbial activity that he wrote down in a notebook of his own, not one he'd inherited from anybody. By the following spring, he decided the only way to actually know anything was to test it himself. He didn't tell his mother that part. He just started collecting peels the following week, and he didn't stop. What followed was less a project and more an education in how many ways one idea can fail. Ethan turned the smallest of the 3 sheds into something between a lab and a disaster zone. He dried peels in mesh trays. He burned a batch down to charcoal, chasing a half-remembered line from one of the library books about biochar, and nearly set off Carol's smoke alarm doing it. He fermented a bucket of shredded rind for 2 weeks, expecting something useful, and got a smell so bad his dog refused to go near that end of the property for a month. He ground peels into powder with an old hand mill he'd found at an estate sale. He mixed them into compost at every ratio he could think of, tracking carbon to nitrogen balance the way one of the bulletins had explained it, adjusting moisture, adjusting temperature, adjusting anything he could think to adjust. Most batches did nothing interesting at all. A few actively made things worse, killing off earthworms in the test bins or turning to a slick, moldy sludge that had to be thrown out entirely. One especially memorable failure drew a family of raccoons that raided the shed 3 nights running before Ethan gave up and moved the trays somewhere less accessible. Neighbors down the road complained about the smell drifting across the fence line during a warm week in July, and Carol had to field 2 separate phone calls apologizing on his behalf without fully understanding what she was apologizing for. Through it all, Ethan kept careful records, tracking every failed batch in his own cramped handwriting, numbering each one so he could go back and compare notes later. He was learning things along the way, whether he realized it or not. He learned that limonene, the oil responsible for the citrus smell, could actually slow down decomposition if peels weren't processed correctly first. He learned how fungal networks in healthy compost competed with less desirable organisms for the same nutrients. None of it read like a textbook to him. It just read like the next thing he needed to understand before the next experiment could work. By late that year, he'd filled 2 notebooks with failures and hadn't found a single result worth showing anyone. Most people would have quit long before that point. Ethan kept going for the same reason he'd kept going since that one afternoon behind the feed store. He simply couldn't leave the question alone once it had gotten into his head. Ethan assumed, like everyone watching from a distance assumed, that he was chasing some kind of miracle fertilizer. That assumption turned out to be wrong, and the way it turned out to be wrong changed the entire direction of what he was doing. It happened almost by accident, the way most real discoveries seem to. Ethan had one compost bin, batch 41 by his count, made from citrus peels processed a specific way he'd only tried once before. He'd planted a row of test seedlings in it alongside identical rows in ordinary compost, mostly to compare growth rates. Growth wasn't what caught his attention. It was disease. A patch of root rot had been slowly working its way through several of his test rows that spring, the kind of soil-borne fungal problem that had quietly plagued parts of the orchard for years. The rows planted in ordinary compost showed it clearly, roots browning and weak. The row planted in batch 41 didn't. Ethan told himself it was a fluke. He ran the comparison again the following month with a fresh batch prepared the same way. Same result. He ran it a third time, changing the seedling variety just to rule out coincidence. Same result again. Somewhere in that third test, the direction of the entire project shifted under him. He wasn't looking at a fertilizer anymore. He was looking at something that seemed to interfere with the disease itself, and that was a very different and much bigger thing to have stumbled into in a shed behind his mother's house. Imagine finding out that something everyone laughed at you for collecting might actually matter. That's exactly where Ethan was standing, not sure yet if he'd found something real or just fooled himself 3 times in a row. Before we get into what happened next, take a second to like this video, subscribe if you're new here, and drop a comment. What's something people once mocked that turned out to be brilliant? You'd be surprised how often that's exactly how big ideas start. Word travels fast in a small county, and it rarely travels accurately. Ethan made the mistake of mentioning his results, cautiously, to a classmate whose family ran a small produce stand. Within 2 weeks, the story had mutated into something unrecognizable. By the time it reached the far side of the county, people were saying Ethan Carter was mixing chemicals in his shed, or lying about results to sell some kind of miracle compost, or worse, deliberately poisoning neighboring soil to make his own look better by comparison. A county agricultural extension officer showed up at the house one afternoon and gave Ethan a stern, well-meaning warning about the dangers of spreading unverified agricultural claims, particularly from a teenager with no formal training. Ethan didn't argue. He just nodded, thanked the man for his time, and went back to the shed once the truck pulled away, though for the first time since he'd started, his confidence wavered. It wasn't the rumors themselves that got to him. It was the fear that maybe the extension officer had a point. Maybe 3 tests in a backyard shed meant nothing at all, and he'd spent a year and a half chasing a coincidence dressed up as a discovery, the same coincidence his own teacher had waved off the day it started. Then, on a Thursday that fall, a car he didn't recognize pulled into the driveway. An older man stepped out, moving slowly, leaning slightly on a cane he clearly resented needing. He introduced himself as Walter Higgs, a retired citrus researcher who'd spent 30 years with a state agricultural program before retiring 2 counties over. He'd heard the rumors like everyone else, but unlike everyone else, he hadn't come to laugh. He didn't ask Ethan to explain himself. He didn't ask him to defend the claims that had been twisted 3 times over by the time they reached him. He just looked at the boy standing in the doorway of a shed full of mismatched jars and said the only thing that mattered. "Young man, show me your notes." Walter spent the better part of 2 weekends going through everything. Every one of Ethan's notebooks, every failed batch, every successful one, the seedling rows still standing in the test plots out back. He asked more questions than Ethan had answered in the past year combined, and for the first time, Ethan found himself explaining his work out loud instead of just recording it in silence. Walter's read on the situation was more measured than anything the rumor mill had produced, and more interesting too. The orange peels themselves weren't the discovery. What Ethan had stumbled onto, without fully realizing it, was a specific composting process that appeared to encourage beneficial microbial activity while making conditions less favorable for the particular soil-borne pathogen that had been damaging the orchard's roots. Walter was careful, almost stubbornly careful, about how he framed it. This wasn't a cure. It wasn't a miracle product, and he told Ethan directly that anyone who tried to sell it as one would be doing real damage to legitimate research down the line. What it was, cautiously stated, was a promising composting method that showed consistent results in a controlled set of tests and deserved to be studied properly with more rigor than one teenager working alone in a shed could realistically provide. At one point, going through the early pages, Walter asked what had made Ethan start in the first place. Ethan told him about the compost heap behind the feed store, the patch of dark soil nobody else had thought twice about, and the teacher who told him it was probably nothing. Walter just nodded slowly, like he'd heard some version of that story more than once in 30 years of research. Most people notice small things like that, he told him. Most people just don't bother finding out why. Together they ran the tests again, this time with more structure. Same result, batch after batch. Walter made a few calls to former colleagues, more out of curiosity than expectation, and within a month, a small university extension program had requested compost samples, along with copies of Ethan's records. Nobody was calling it a breakthrough yet, but for the first time since the government trucks would eventually pull down that gravel road, something in Ethan's shed had a name that wasn't a joke. Once the university got involved, everything moved faster than Ethan was prepared for. Agricultural researchers requested a formal site visit, which is what put those government vehicles and soil probes in the orchard that had confused the neighbors in the first place. A regional farming bulletin ran a short piece on the early findings, and within a week, a reporter from a national outlet picked it up and turned it into a longer feature. Ethan gave his first television interview sitting on a hay bale outside the same shed where raccoons had once raided his failed experiments, looking noticeably uncomfortable in front of a camera crew twice the size of his graduating class. The headlines that followed were more careful than Ethan expected, thanks largely to Walter's insistence on accurate framing. One outlet ran the story under a headline about a teenager reviving a forgotten composting method. Another focused on how a waste product most farms threw away might hold promise for sustainable soil management. A farming magazine profiled him with a headline about a high school student inspiring new agricultural interest in citrus byproducts. He wasn't famous because he'd found a miracle. He was getting attention because he'd refused to stop testing something Everyone told him wasn't worth his time. The same grocery stores that had once treated his weekly pickups as a mild inconvenience now set orange peels aside specifically for him, in some cases proudly telling customers about it. Kids who used to leave rinds in his mailbox as a prank started asking, half seriously, whether he needed help over the summer. The restaurant owner, who'd once joked about somebody finally appreciating their trash, now kept a framed newspaper clipping by the register. A reporter, during one of the later interviews, asked Ethan the question everyone eventually got around to. What made him keep going, batch after failed batch, for almost 2 years, when every adult around him had a reason for him to stop? Ethan thought about it longer than the reporter expected. He didn't mention his father, or the sentence said over a compost pile years earlier, though it crossed his mind the way it always did. What he actually said was smaller than that and truer. He said he'd just never been able to leave a believer question alone once it got stuck in his head, not since he was a kid taking apart broken radios in the garage to see what was inside them, long before there was ever an orchard in trouble, or a father who left, or any of the rest of it. There hadn't been a hidden notebook. There hadn't been a map somebody left behind for him to follow. There had just been one strange, dark patch of soil behind a feed store, a teacher who shrugged it off, and a boy who couldn't stand not knowing why. That turned out to be enough. A year later, the shed still smells faintly of citrus most afternoons, though it's a working test space now, not a solitary teenager's secret. The county started a small community composting program modeled loosely on Ethan's early methods, and 2 schools in the district began teaching students about food waste reduction using his research as a case study. Local farms in the area have started setting aside citrus scraps rather than sending them to landfill, a small shift that wouldn't have happened without a boy nobody understood driving a pickup truck to grocery store dumpsters after school. Ethan still doesn't talk much. He's started speaking at a handful of agricultural events now, though he's careful, the way Walter taught him to be careful, never claiming more than the research actually supports. He introduces himself the same way every time, not as someone with answers, but as someone who never stopped asking questions. Every orange peel he ever collected looked like garbage to somebody. Every laugh aimed at him sounded certain at the time. Every failed batch in that shed felt, more than once, like proof he should quit. None of that turned out to be the ending. Sometimes the discoveries that matter most don't start with an inheritance, or a clue, or a secret waiting to be found. Sometimes they start with a kid who notices something small and simply refuses to let it go.